By the late 1960s, the GT moniker was being slapped on everything from economy cars to sports cars, and in some cases, actual Grand Tours, or in the U.S., what would quickly become known as pony cars. The entry-level American performance car would have to have been the Corvair, with new styling for 1965, along with new fully independent suspension. Prices were $2,100 to $2,700. 183 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase, and 2,400 to 2,800 pounds. And the 2.8-liter rear-mounted flat six came in 99, 140, or 180 horsepower turbo version. Technically, it was still just a compact car, but one that would become known as the poor man's Porsche. And a turbo was a mid-15-second car, and could do nearly 115 miles an hour. More than 235,000 Corvairs sold for the year. The Mustang would get longer and wider for 1967, with slightly more aggressive but similar styling. Prices remained low, starting at $2,500 to $2,700. It was 184 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase, and weight was 2,800 to 3,200 pounds. Engines included a 120 horsepower 3.3-liter 200 cubic inch straight six, 4.7-liter 289 V8, with 200 to 271 horsepower, or a 6.4-liter 390 with 320 horsepower. Roughly 470,000 sold for the year, and a GTA could do 130 miles an hour and a 14.5-second quarter mile. Plymouth's Barracuda was also restyled for 1967, with more body styles and looking less like a Valiant. It was slightly cheaper than a Mustang, but sold less than 65,000 for the year. 193 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase, it was 3,000 to 3,300 pounds. The base 3.7-liter 225 slant six had 145 horsepower. The 273 V8, 180 to 235 horsepower, and the 6.3-liter 383, 280 horsepower. The quarter mile took less than 15 seconds, and it could reach 120 miles an hour. Chevrolet's new Camaro came on strong for 1967, costing a bit more than the Mustang while selling $220,000. It was 185 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase and weighed 2,900 to 3,600 pounds. Base engine was a 140 horsepower 3.8-liter 230 straight six, with an optional 155 horsepower 4.1-liter six, while V8s included a 4.6-liter 283, 5-liter 302, 5.4-liter 327, 5.7-liter 350, and 6.5-liter 396, with horsepower ranging from 195 to 375. A 4-speed Super Sport 396 had 410 pound-feet of torque and took just over 14 seconds to do the quarter mile, with a top speed of 135 miles an hour. In 1968, AMC introduced the Javelin. Priced at $2,500 to $2,600, 56,000 sold its first year. It was 189 inches long on a 109-inch wheelbase and weighed 2,900 to 3,200 pounds. Engines were a 3.8-liter 232 straight six with 145 horsepower, a 4.7-liter 290 V8 with 200 to 225 horsepower, or a 5.6-liter 343 with 290 horsepower. Good for a quarter mile under 15.5 seconds, and a top speed over 130. They also introduced a 2-foot shorter 2-seat version, only available with the V8, as the AMX. Starting at $3,200, only 6,700 sold, but it included a 315 horsepower 6.4-liter 390 that would soon find its way into the Javelin, and made the AMX a mid-14-second car. For 1967, Pontiac got the Firebird for $2,700 to $2,900, with first-year sales over 80,000. It was 189 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase and 3,100 to 3,400 pounds. Engine choices included a 3.8-liter 230 straight six, a 5.3-liter 326 V8, or 6.6-liter 400. Horsepower ranged from 155 to 325, with a Ram Air 400 doing a mid-13-second quarter mile and reaching speeds around 110 miles an hour. Mercury got a bigger, better-equipped version of the Mustang for 1967 as the Cougar. Starting at $2,900 to $3,200, it was 190 inches long on a 111-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,100 to 3,400 pounds. More than 150,000 sold for the year, initially with your choice of a 4.7-liter 289 V8 or a 6.4-liter 390 with 200 to 320 horsepower for a quarter mile in the mid-14s and a top speed near 135. 1967 would be the last year of the second-generation Chevrolet Corvette, priced $4,100 to $4,400, more than 20,000 sold. It was 175 inches long on a 98-inch wheelbase and 3,200 to 3,300 pounds. Engines were either a 5.4-liter 327 or 7-liter 427 with 300 to 435 horsepower. An L88 was a mid-13-second car able to exceed 140 miles an hour. Shelby's legendary 1966 427 Cobra cost around $7,500, with less than 1,000 being built. It was 156 inches long on a 90-inch wheelbase and less than 2,400 pounds. The 7-liter Ford V8 produced 355 horsepower and 459 pound-feet of torque for a quarter mile in the mid-12-second range, 60 in about 4 seconds, and a top speed over 135. From Britain, the Peel Viking was essentially a fiberglass-bodied Austin Mini, using the same 850cc4 with a little under 40 horsepower. It could do 75 miles an hour, and the quarter mile in about 21.5 seconds. The Austin Sprite was more civilized for 1966, only 138 inches long on an 80-inch wheelbase and 1,600 pounds. Its 1300 produced 65 horsepower and 72 pound-feet of torque for a mid-18-second quarter mile and a top speed around 95. The Lotus Europa was 156 inches long on a 91-inch wheelbase, weighing 1,400 pounds. Its 1,500cc Renault 4 produced 81 horsepower and 80 pound-feet of torque for a quarter mile under 17 seconds and a top speed over 120 miles an hour. TVR's Grand Tourer Mark III ran until 1967, 138 inches long on an 86-inch wheelbase. Its 1,800cc inline 4 had a standard tune of 94 horsepower, but modifications could be made at customer request. The MGB was offered in traditional roadster and as a GT coupe. At 153 inches long on a 91-inch wheelbase, it was 2,000 to 2,300 pounds, and used an 1800 with 95 horsepower and 111 pound-feet of torque. For a mid-17-second quarter mile, a top speed around 115 miles an hour, and it got about 25 miles per gallon. The Morgan Plus 4 Plus was one of the most modern-styled Morgans ever, but only 26 were made. It was 149 inches long on a 96-inch wheelbase and 1,800 pounds, using a Triumph 2.1-liter inline 4 with 110 horsepower, making it capable of 115 miles an hour. The Reliant Scimitar was introduced in 1964, 168 inches long on a 92-inch wheelbase and weighing 2,400 pounds. It used a 2.6-liter straight 6 with 120 horsepower and 140 pound-feet of torque for a quarter mile in the high 17s and a top speed over 105. The Austin-Healey 3000 Mark III was 158 inches long on a 92-inch wheelbase and just over 2,500 pounds. Its 2.9-liter straight 6 pumped out 148 horsepower and 173 pound-feet of torque for a mid-16-second quarter mile and 120 mile-an-hour top speed. Triumph's TR5 was short-lived, but cost under 1,300 pounds. It was 154 inches long on an 88-inch wheelbase, weighing 2,300 pounds, with a 2.5-liter straight 6 producing 150 horsepower for up to 125 miles an hour. Sunbeam offered the Tiger from 1964 to 1967, in essence just an Alpine with a Ford V8. As such, it was 156 inches long on an 86-inch wheelbase and nearly 2,700 pounds, and only 7,000 were made, most with a 4.3-liter 260 with 164 horsepower from the factory, but dealer-installed performance parts were an option. Priced under 1,500 pounds in Britain, or $3,500 in the U.S., 60 took 8.5 seconds, and top speed was 120. Jaguar's Type E or XKE Series 2, was introduced in 1968. 175 inches long on a 96-inch wheelbase and 2,900 pounds, and using a 4.2-liter straight six with 265 horsepower and 283 pound-feet of torque. The quarter mile took just over 15 seconds, and it could do 145 miles an hour. Aston Martin's DB6 was 182 inches long on a 102-inch wheelbase and just under 3,300 pounds. Its 4-liter straight six produced 282 horsepower and 288 pound-feet of torque for a mid-14-second quarter mile and a top speed near 150. The Jensen Interceptor was 188 inches long on a 105-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,500 pounds, powered by a Chrysler 6.3-liter 383 V8 with 325 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque for a low 14-second quarter mile and a top speed over 130. The French Simca 1000 Coupe was roughly 155 inches long on an 87-inch wheelbase and under 1,800 pounds. Its 950cc inline-4 produced just over 50 horsepower for a top speed just over 90 and a quarter mile in under 22 seconds. The Renault Caravelle ran until 1968, with more than 115,000 having been sold over the previous decade. It was 168 inches long on an 89-inch wheelbase and weighed approximately 1,800 pounds, with a starting price over 1,000 pounds. It could be had with a 55 horsepower 1100, taking nearly 18 seconds to reach 60 and topping out near 90, while the Alpine A110 was 159 inches long on an 89-inch wheelbase and 1,300 pounds. In 1969, the top model used a 1,300 inline-4 with 118 horsepower and 90 pound-feet of torque for a quarter mile just over 15 seconds and a top speed near 125. Germany had the Volkswagen Kharman-Ghia. It was 163 inches long on a 95-inch wheelbase, weighing 1,800 pounds, with your choice of 34 horsepower 1,200 or 49 horsepower 1,300. The NSU Spyder was the first regular production vehicle to use a Wankel rotary, but fewer than 2,400 were made. It was 141 inches long on a 79-inch wheelbase, weighing 1,500 pounds. Producing 54 horsepower, the single-rotor engine moved the car to more than 90 miles an hour and a mid-19-second quarter mile. The Glass GT was 159 inches long on a 91-inch wheelbase, with either an 84 horsepower 1300 or a 99 horsepower 1700. Weighing less than 1,800 pounds, it did the quarter mile in under 17 seconds, with a top speed near 115. Produced from 1964 to 1967, in 1968, it became the BMW 1600 GT. The Opel GT was introduced in 1968, using either a 67 horsepower 1100 or 102 horsepower 1900. It was 162 inches long on a 96-inch wheelbase and 1,900 to 2,100 pounds. The more powerful version did the quarter mile in the high 17s and could top 110 miles an hour. Porsche introduced the 911 in 1964. It was 164 inches long on an 87-inch wheelbase and 2,300 to 2,400 pounds, with prices around $6,500. Initially using an 128 horsepower 2-liter Boxer flat 6 with a 5-speed manual. 1967 added an S version with 178 horsepower, which could do a mid-15-second quarter mile and 135 miles an hour. Mercedes built nearly 50,000 of the second-generation SL, offered in 230, 250, and 280. It was 171 inches long on a 95-inch wheelbase and 2,900 pounds, with 148 to 195 horsepower, making a 280 SL a high 15-second car with a top speed over 130. In Italy, Fiat introduced the 124 Spyder in 1966. It was 156 inches long on a 90-inch wheelbase and 2,100 pounds, initially with a 96 horsepower 1.4-liter for speeds over 105 miles an hour and a mid-18-second quarter mile. Alfa Romeo's Spyder of 1966 sold for $4,000 in the U.S. It was 167 inches long on an 89-inch wheelbase, weighing 2,200 to 2,300 pounds. Initially with an 108 horsepower 1600, it upgraded to 116 horsepower 1800 for 1968, for a top speed near 115 and a high 16-second quarter mile. The Dino 206 was on a 90-inch wheelbase and 193 inches long, weighing 2,000 pounds. With a 2-liter V6 pushing 177 horsepower, it did a 14-second quarter mile with a top speed near 150. The Maserati Mistral sold a total of less than 1,000. It was 177 inches long on a 95-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,200 pounds. The straight six came in 3.5, 3.7, and 4-liter versions with 235, 245, and 265 horsepower. A 4000 GT could reach nearly 150 miles an hour and did a high 14-second quarter mile. The Iso Grifo was introduced in 1965, initially with a 300 horsepower 5.4-liter Chevy 327. It was 174 inches long on a 98-inch wheelbase and 3,200 pounds, with a top speed near 170 and a mid-13-second quarter mile. De Tomaso introduced the Mangusta in 1967, with roughly 400 being made. 168 inches long on a 98-inch wheelbase, it weighed 2,900 pounds, initially with a Ford 289 with 302 horsepower for 150 miles an hour and a low 13-second quarter mile. Later American versions used a more basic 2-barrel 302 with 230 horsepower. Lamborghini's Miura was 172 inches long on a 98-inch wheelbase and weighed 2,800 pounds. Powered by a 3.9-liter V12 with 345 horsepower and 279 pound-feet of torque for a mid-13-second quarter mile and a top speed over 170. The Ferrari 365 GTB4 was introduced in 1968 and is more commonly referred to as the Daytona for its 1-2-3 finish there in 1967. Roughly 1,400 were made, 174 inches long on a 95-inch wheelbase, weighing a little over 2,600 pounds. The 4.4-liter V12 had 347 horsepower and moved the car to 170 miles an hour and a mid-13-second quarter mile. There was the Swiss Monteverde High-Speed 375 introduced in 1967. The original S was 180 inches long on a 99-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,700 pounds with a Chrysler 7.2-liter 440 V8. Rated at 375 horsepower, it did a low 14-second quarter mile and had a top speed near 160. From Sweden, the Saab Sonnet 2 was 148 inches long on an 85-inch wheelbase and 1,600 pounds. The Saab 840cc 2-stroke 3 produced 59 horsepower, while the 1500 Ford V4 produced 72 horsepower. Either could do the quarter mile in about 18 seconds and nearly reach 110 miles an hour, with the V4 having a slight advantage. Volvo's P1800S of 1966 was on a 97-inch wheelbase, was 171 inches long and 2,500 pounds. The inline 4 had 115 horsepower and could push the car to nearly 110 miles an hour. In Japan, Honda's S800 ran from 1966 to 1970. It was 131 inches long on a 79-inch wheelbase and 1,600 pounds. With 79 horsepower, it did an 18-second quarter mile and had a top speed of 95. Starting in 1965, you could get a Datsun Fairlady 1600, 154 inches long on a 90-inch wheelbase. It weighed 2,000 pounds. The inline 4 produced 89 horsepower for an 18-second quarter mile and a top speed near 105. The original Nissan Silvia ran until 1968, with more than 550 being made. It was 159 inches long on a 90-inch wheelbase and weighed 2,200 pounds. With the same 89 horsepower engine, it took nearly an additional half a second to do the quarter mile. The Mazda Cosmo of 1967 used a 1-liter twin-rotor Wankel with 109 horsepower. It was 163 inches long on an 87-inch wheelbase and 2,100 pounds. Top speed was over 115, and it could do the quarter mile in the mid-17s. Toyota made roughly 350 of the 2000 GT from 1967 to 1969. On a 92-inch wheelbase, it was 164 inches long and 2,500 pounds. The straight six made 148 horsepower. and it was priced in the U.S. at over $7,100. Claimed top speed was 135. But performance priorities would soon be shifting, as would sporty offerings. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.